All right, joining me for my second interview of the day is Drew Savicki from Twitter. I hope I got your name right, by the way.
Yes.
So what have you been up to this past year? I know that you've been doing analysis of state level politics. You want to talk more about that?
So this year I vote for 270 to win. I finished up the Road to 270 series. I essentially did the second half of the series, covering each state, trying to sum up their state's politics, trying to condense it to about 2,000 words, and try and make it accessible. What I think is important to know about every state's politics and why you should care, even if the state isn't competitive at the presidential level. There's always something to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you this based on the few articles I've read from your series. I think I've got my New Year's Day reading all planned out. I feel like what was especially interesting was what happened this year in New Hampshire, where Biden won by a bigger margin than Hillary Clinton did, but Republicans swept the state level elections, taking the legislature and the executive council.
Yeah, Governor been pretty darn popular, and he had enough coattails to flip both chambers of the legislature and take the executive council with him as well. It's rather an anomaly in the New England states, as none of the other governors have really had any sort of coattails. Although Phil Scott sort of did, he helped Republicans break the Democratic supermajority in the state legislature. In fact, the Speaker of the Vermont House lost re-election to a Republican this year. She actually represented a competitive seat. But yeah, not to the extent we saw in New Hampshire, where Sununu really had huge coattails, but they just only applied at the state level. Republicans just could not make any gains federally in New Hampshire. That's what's really interesting about New Hampshire, and it's why Sununu would be a formidable candidate against Senator Hassan if he does run. Despite the state's federal partisanship, he's proven himself pretty darn popular.
I mean, I actually did not know Republicans broke the supermajority in Vermont. That really means Democrats are not going to be able to get anything done for the next couple of years.
Yeah, they're not going to be able to override Scott's vetoes, but they generally work together pretty well. Scott was in the state Senate for a while before he was lieutenant governor and now governor, so he knows many Democrats in the legislature quite well. So he knows what he's doing. He definitely has a lot of experience working with Democrats in the state. So I think they'll be able to agree on a lot of stuff.
I joke that that Biden should appoint Phil Scott to the cabinet as a token Republican, in order to give Democrats the trifecta. But even though the Democrat who won the lieutenant governor's race, I think she only won by single digits.
Yeah, so Democrat Molly Gray only won by about 7 points against Republican Scott Milney, from a minor political dynasty in the state. He had the strong backing of Phil Scott, so a lot of Democrats crossed over for him. He ran against Patrick Leahy in 2016 and had a fairly decent showing against him. So he had some residual name ID.
Yeah. Why don't we talk more about map making? What made you decide to get into map making? Because it's arguably what you're probably best known for.
Yeah, well, I saw, it was a few years ago, I saw one of J. Miles Coleman's articles for Decision Desk. It was on North Carolina, and, I was really interested in, how did he do all these cool maps? And I joined Twitter and reached out to him, and he pointed me in the right direction, and I've been hooked ever since. I love making maps. I think it's a great way to visualize elections. It's one thing to read, X candidate won by 5 points. Well, what does that look like? That's what I like to show.
So let's talk about what happened in throughout the U.S. this year, starting with North Carolina, because I think a lot of people expected Democrats to do very well in North Carolina, and by very well I mean nearly sweep the Council of State, defeat Tom Tillis and Biden winning the state. And obviously none of that happened. And I believe that Republicans won both of the state Supreme Court races. So what happened?
Yeah, I mean, Biden not winning the state had real down ballot consequences. I mean, one of the things to contrast North Carolina with Georgia is we're a much more rural state than Georgia. We don't have as big of a suburban urban in the rurals yet. Well, that's really the big problem here for them, is there's still more room to fall in those places.
Yeah, and it's not just in the rural, more majority white areas like out west. There's Republicans are arguably making inroads in the Northeast, but particularly in Williamson County. I believe it's a third Native American and just a third white. So and Republicans made big gains there.
Yeah.
I actually heard a story that apparently a local Democratic official in Robeson County was told by his constituents, I'm voting for you this one time, but if you're not a Republican by the next time, then you're done.
I believe it's a very socially conservative county. It overwhelmingly voted against. It overwhelmingly voted for banning same-sex marriage here in North Carolina in 2012. It's no surprise that Republicans are really gaining there. I mean, the same-sex marriage ban swept every precinct in the county back then, particularly in the Lumbee-heavy precincts where it got really just huge numbers. These voters are not really gettable for Democrats anymore. They don't really agree with the party on social issues. So they're going to keep moving away from Democrats. As for the local offices, Democrats might be able to hold on for a little while longer, but yeah, having most of this stuff up in presidential years really hurts. If they were up in midterm years, the party would be able to hold on for much, much longer.
I think there were not a lot of people, notwithstanding the crystal balls prediction, I don't think that there were a lot of people who thought that that Florida would be to the right of North Carolina and North Carolina would be to the right of Georgia, with the first two going for Trump and the last one going for Biden. I think that I was actually talking about this with Eric earlier in the day, that the Elections Daily predicted Biden would win Florida and North Carolina, Trump would win Georgia, and the opposite in all three states happened instead. So yeah, I guess are there what trends are you've talked about the trends that are happening in North Carolina, how Republicans still have more room to grow. What's happening in Georgia and what's happening in Florida?
Well, Georgia, it's really, there are two things people focus on. People focus on Biden's gains in Atlanta Metro, but I like to talk about the rest of the state. Biden did better in some of those rural northern counties where Republicans simply have no more votes to get. They've run out of new votes to win up in those places. They've maxed out in many of these rural counties. And so they only have room to fall in them. That's becoming a problem for Republicans in Georgia now. Trump only improved. He improved in some of the rural counties, but he saw swings against him in so many of them. Because when you've been winning 80 to 90% of voters there for, 10, 20 years, you can't really hold on to that kind of margin for that much longer. And in Florida, Biden's weakness with minority voters was really apparent, particularly in Miami. He did great in white suburbs. He did great in Jacksonville. He did great in Seminole County. It wasn't enough. His falling off with minority voters who are, a very large voting bloc in Florida has real consequences. And if the Florida GOP really does keep targeting them like Texas Republicans do, well, that's going to be a problem for Democrats.
I think the Texas GOP, the Florida GOP is absolutely amazing at what they do, and Texas GOP, I guess, notwithstanding Alan West in charge of it now, is also been doing a pretty decent job at reaching out to Latinos in the Rio Grande Valley. I guess what I'm wondering is to what extent are the shifts with Latinos towards the GOP permanent, particularly in Miami and some of the more urban areas of the Rio Grande, because this is not the first time Republicans have done this well with Latinos. Bush in 2004 arguably did even better. In fact, I think he won Cameron County, Texas, which is home to Brownsville. So, to what extent is this a permanent shift? And
you see, that's really the big question, and that's why I think redistricting, Republicans might not want to overreach, as you can't really say for certain that the Hispanic shift is permanent. Which election is more reflective of Hispanic partisanship? Is it 2016 or is it 2020? Hillary Clinton handily won Florida's 26th congressional district in 2016. Well, Trump won it this time. So, it's hard to figure out which one of those two elections is really more reflective. And if they overreach, that could have huge consequences. They really need to be careful about that, in assuming that those voters that swung towards Trump are going to stay for other Republicans. I'm not sure, but at the same time, we saw this stuff go down ballot. When these trends start spreading down ballot, that tends to indicate it's more permanent. So it's a mixture of both, I think. Incumbent presidents do very well with minority voters. That seems to be a recurring trend. But I don't know if they'll stick with Republicans post-Trump. I think that's really the big question.
Right. And so it'll be interesting to see, particularly in Arizona, which Biden actually managed to flip despite the shift among Latinos. So it'll be particularly interesting to see, because I've always felt that Arizona and Georgia could very well be where Colorado and Virginia were a decade ago. And sometimes I'm wondering if that's the case with Georgia and Arizona, while at the same time Republicans have found a way to keep North Carolina, Florida, and Texas light red, at least for a while.
Yeah, so, one of the things about Arizona that I thought that stood out to me is that Trump did bring out a ton of rural Republican voters this time. And that almost cost Biden a state despite winning Maricopa County. That could be a problem for Democrats down the line. If Republicans can keep bringing out this huge swath of rural voters in places like Mojave County, Pinal, Greenlee, these kinds of places where there's a big chunk of rural voters that can eat into the margins.
There's a county in southwestern Arizona, I forget what it's called. It's not Pima County, but
Yuma.
Yeah, I believe I was expecting, based on Trump's margin in 2016, for that county to go to Biden. That did not happen.
Yes, I was surprised by that too. Yes, and Mark Kelly was unable to flip it either. Yeah, Yuma Democrats really seem stuck at about 46% of the vote. That really seems to be getting past that, seems to be a hurdle right now. There don't seem to be very many gettable voters beyond that amount. It seems like Democrats have hit a wall there for whatever reason. I know it has something of a military presence as well, so I'm a bit surprised that it didn't flip, as we saw military voters swung against Trump pretty heavily. But I guess the Hispanic trend sort of kept it in the Republican column this year.
Yeah. I guess one thing that Democrats might feel optimistic about is if what happens to some of the more suburban areas of Denver starts happening to places like Scottsdale or Glendale or Mesa, then it could very well be that Republicans can't win Arizona. But I have to say, Democrats are aided by the fact that the Republicans in Arizona are currently being run by extremists. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, the McCain wing of the party is really going away. Yeah, I mean Republicans did just by the barest of margins hang on to the legislature, but it's getting way too close for their comfort. They've lost both U.S. Senate seats. They're in a minority of the state's House delegation now. They only control half the statewide offices now. Can they fix things up? I'm not terribly confident they will, given the way they're being led, the direction they're going in. But yeah, some of the Phoenix suburbs are pretty interesting, as both Biden and Mark Kelly couldn't flip Arizona's 6th district. They both still lost it by that same 3.5 to 4 point margin. Democrats have hit a wall. They're unable to really get past that. It's home to a lot of there are a lot of retirees in the Phoenix suburbs, and those seem to be the obstacle for Democrats right now.
Though, mind you, Arizona is going to gain a congressional seat, I think. So it'll be interesting to see what the map ends up looking like.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. Arizona uses nonpartisan redistricting commission. Yeah, though the governor, Doug Ducey, has pushed it to the right a bit. So we'll see what map they draw this time.
Yeah. Is there any other states that we should keep an eye out in, like that could become competitive? Because like one of the things that I've been Eric Cunningham mentioned the possibility that a couple of currently safe New England states could, wander into single-digit territory. I've made the proposition that maybe Kansas could wander into single-digit territory. What do you think?
Yeah, well, probably the only New England state that's really concerning for Democrats is Maine, given how rural and overwhelmingly white it is. That's really the only one that seems particularly concerning. Maybe Rhode Island, but Providence really dominates the state's politics, so that seems rather unlikely. And New Hampshire, as the suburbs, trading blue collar voters for suburbanites is a bad trade in New Hampshire. It doesn't work. That is a very poor trade. I agree on Kansas. I think that has real potential to keep swinging left as the years keep going, as Trump carried it by one of the worst GOP margins in quite some time. A little bit worse than McCain in 2008, in fact. So.
Just circling back to New Hampshire, one thing I noticed that I thought was pretty interesting is the fact that I believe the majority rural district is actually still to this day the more democratic of the two congressional districts.
So New Hampshire's 2nd district includes, it stretches into rural New Hampshire, but it also includes a bunch of the state's cities, and a bunch of college towns. So that's why it's so reliably Democratic, as well as the areas along the Vermont border as well. Those are very liberal areas. We've seen the same broader trends in the 2nd district that we've seen elsewhere. Ann Kuster, who represents it, she's seen her margins decline in the rural areas and the blue collar towns, but she's been gaining in the traditionally very Republican suburbs along the Massachusetts border.
It's interesting to see, I guess, all these different trends that are happening, because I feel like particularly in the New England area, there are trends happening that you would not have assumed if you were looking at anywhere else in the country. Like there are still small towns that are very blue and are arguably getting bluer throughout New England. And obviously,
New England, the education. Education is really one of the big things that keeps New England so heavily Democratic, as Massachusetts in particular. Republicans really can only rely on a few areas of the state for votes. And that's why it's so hard to draw a reliable Republican congressional district, as Republican voters are simply too spread out. And there aren't enough of them. And it would probably, you could draw like a slightly Trump district in 2016, it would still probably elect a Democrat, just given the Democratic bench in the state. You know, there's no shortage of Democratic legislators who could run for such a seat. Whereas on the Republican side, you know, they're like in the single digits in the state Senate, and they have only a few, like a dozen or so members in the state House. So they don't exactly have much of a bench.
When it comes,
But we've seen the same trends in Massachusetts. Democrats have carried every town in Berkshire County, Massachusetts for gosh knows how long, but one little town, aptly named Florida in northeastern Berkshire, is just barely hanging in there. Yeah, it's a very blue collar town. The Democrats, it probably flips in 4 years. I think Biden only just barely carried it like a point and a half or something. So it's almost there just to break the streak in these kinds of places.
same thing with Fall River, right? You've talked about the town of Fall River.
Yeah. Yeah, Fall River's really interesting. Yeah, that's home to a large Portuguese population. It's very blue collar. Yeah, it's the kind of place where Democrats are really falling off in recent years. Biden did worse than Clinton, and Clinton did worse than Obama. Yeah, and Fall River, New Bedford, that area is, yeah, has a lot of historically manufacturing. It has a history of textile mills. It's the kind of place where you'd think Trump would be doing well. It matches the same kind of stuff in the Midwest.
Right. And I guess there's a couple of cities in, moving away from New England for just a second, there's a couple of cities in Pennsylvania that I find really interesting. It's Reading in Berks County and Hazleton in Luzerne County. I believe that there's a large Latino population in both of those cities. So it's in fact, I think Hazleton in particular was 95% white in 2000, and now it's majority Hispanic. So it's interesting to see what's happened or what's going to happen in towns like that.
Yeah, Hazleton is one of those places that, yeah, despite its demographics, yeah, when you start looking at things like education level and income level, you start to realize, oh, well, that's why it's Republican now. Yeah, that's where Lou Barletta is from. He was mayor of Hazleton for a while. Yeah, it's the kind of place where Republicans are going to keep doing well for the foreseeable future. Yeah, one interesting area of Pennsylvania is obviously south central PA, places like Lancaster and York.
And
Those very traditionally GOP areas where someday they'll go blue. Yeah. Lancaster's not there yet. It didn't vote for Tom Wolf, but it still saw that same sizable swing towards them.
Yeah, and South Central Pennsylvania in general, like Cumberland County, which is, I believe, highly educated and professional, it shifted blue.
Mm-hmm.
I believe Trump still won it, but you know the blue shift among educated professionals is everywhere, even in smaller, less populated areas. I do want to take a look at Nevada, though, because I found it interesting that despite the national shift, Nevada barely budged.
Yeah, Nevada is very stubbornly just slightly Democratic. It's proven relatively immune to what's been going on in the nation. Yeah, there aren't a whole lot of swing voters in Nevada. The Biden, did pretty well in Washoe County, which is much more suburban and whiter than Clark. So we've seen the same trends there. Yeah, Biden did see a drop in among Hispanics in Nevada, but it wasn't as severe a drop as we saw in places like Texas. And I think one of my theories why is because Nevada is so heavily unionized. That's why I think Nevada is an unlikely Republican target, is its high level of unionization. That's what keeps it probably reliably Dem. Even if it's only just slightly Democratic, that's what's going to keep it in that position for a while.
I definitely want to get back to various states, but I do want to take a look. I get the upcoming elections, not but because as I'm going to point out to you, I think I pointed out on Twitter earlier, like several days ago, it's that I think the prospects of Democrats controlling any branch of Congress after 2024 is very unlikely, for the simple reason that Republicans in 2022 can flip the House in 2 years from now on redistricting alone, and the fact that in 2024 the map, as I pointed out, for the Senate is pretty bad. Like 3 senators in Trump won states, 5 in states that Biden won by less than 3%, and there's no Republican in a corresponding situation on that map. So I guess what I'm wondering is in 2024 whether all the focus will be for Democrats will be on the presidential election rather than like Congress, and whether the DCCC and the DSCC will be it will be nearly broke, whereas whoever's the Democratic nominee for president will be raking in cash. Because I feel like that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, the 2024 map for Democrats in the Senate is going to be a problem, as that features the bulk of the swing state senators are up for re-election. You've got some stronger incumbents like Bob Casey and Tammy Baldwin. They've proven pretty successful over the years, but even they might face trouble running ahead of the ticket if the Democratic ticket is losing those states. And you have Jackie Rosen in Nevada. Yeah, there are a lot of them. The only one that I think of this, I guess Minnesota is arguably a swing state, but I think everyone would agree that Klobuchar would be a significant favorite given her substantial crossover appeal over the years, given that she runs way ahead of the ticket. And Maine could be a problem for Democrats too, as Angus King is likely retiring. Though outside Susan Collins, I'm not really sure who Republicans have that they could run for a Senate seat in Maine these days.
Paul Lepage seems like a
little success. Yeah, and they've got former state senator Eric Brakey. He was the nominee against King in 2018, and he ran for the 2nd congressional district this year. But his very libertarian conservative stances are unlikely to play well at the state level. I suspect he'd have a great deal of trouble.
I guess, yeah. I mean,
24 is it's going to be a problem. As are also a couple of red state Dems up, like Sherrod Brown,
John Tester, Joe Manchin.
Yeah, those. Brown is going to be in for a real struggle. Just given the fact that Democrats are not likely to target Ohio on the presidential map again anytime soon.
It's especially the case if say Republicans nominate someone like Anthony Gonzalez as their nominee.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. He'd be a tough nominee for Brown. Definitely.
My guess would be, if I had to say now, I'm guessing Gonzalez would be probably the best recruit for Republicans in Ohio. My guess is in Montana, it's going to be Tester versus Rosendale again. And I'd say Manchin might not run for re-election, and Patrick Morrissey will probably be the Republican nominee for that, if I had to guess. I doubt Manchin is running again at this point. I don't think he really has it in him to run another grueling slog of a campaign. I think that would be too much for him at this point. But I guess moving more on to the Midwest, what I found interesting was that, I guess, once again, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, you could argue it maybe is not Midwest at all, but they were all close as they were, say, in 2000 or 2004. I think it was really Obama that really made people wrongly think that those Midwestern states are not competitive. And maybe in some ways that 2020 was a reversion to form. But Minnesota saw a particularly large margin for Biden. I'm wondering if something different happened there than in the other states.
I mean, look at the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area. Really accounts for the biggest chunk of the vote in the state. Rural Minnesota is losing population quite quickly, and the Minneapolis area is growing. Yeah, Minnesota is not that realistic of a Republican target, it seems. It's just not, just based on the political geography of the state. There just aren't enough votes in outstate Minnesota for Republicans unless they can find some way to get those margins down in the Minneapolis area.
Yeah.
As
Well,
Biden carried the 3rd congressional district by 19 points. I mean, that was only like Obama +1 in 2012. So that's going to become a huge, huge problem.
yeah. I do remember vaguely reading that that of the some of the biggest metropolitan areas in some of these states, like Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, Wayne County, Michigan, and Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, all of those areas are actually declining in population, whereas Hennepin County, Minnesota, I think is growing.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah. The big cities in other similar states are declining. Yeah, whereas the Minneapolis area is booming at
Yeah,
a
so
very
I'm
quick
guessing that's
pace.
one of the things that was different from the other two. Like that, like Wisconsin was really close. I believe it was the closest of the three once again. What I mean was to say is that Wisconsin was once again the state that decided the electoral college, if you align them by margin. What I'm wondering is Wisconsin? I've heard, I think someone mentioned this, and I think it may have been you who mentioned it, that Wisconsin may be where Missouri was like 20 years ago. Is that how you see it?
Mm, you know, Wisconsin is pretty interesting, as you know, the blood red Milwaukee suburbs remain the biggest obstacle for Democrats. If they can really start making gains in the WOW counties, that would help tremendously, as Biden did finally win a town in the WOW counties for the first time in many, many years. A Democratic candidate won one. So there are some signs that that's shifting, but it's at a much, much slower pace than we've seen other suburbs. The Milwaukee suburbs are moving left very, very slowly.
One thing I noticed about Biden's margins is that in the state Supreme Court race from earlier in the year, the progressive, I think, was -21 in Waukesha and -11 in Azauki, and I believe that's roughly what Biden's deficits were in those counties, and yet that progressive won by 10.5%, and Biden won by 0.5%. So I think that you're
Yeah,
right.
Biden really fell off in Western Wisconsin. That's the big problem. The driftless area, as it's called, that's becoming quickly Democrats' biggest problem in the state. As they've done well when Trump is not on the ballot, as we saw in the Wisconsin Supreme Court races and in the 2018 elections. Democrats do well there when Trump is not on the ballot. And we'll see in 2024, but yeah, that area is living up to its name as driftless. It is really drifting away from the party.
It probably means that Biden would have to do even better than what I thought were his benchmarks in the WOW counties. You know, because I thought that when he hit those margins, that's about as good as you can do if you're a Democrat. He probably now has to do even better than that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. He'll have to find some more votes to get in those places than because he'll need to offset the West and the North. Yeah, he'll have to find some more votes, and and maybe win Green Bay. That's been a difficult one for Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Ron Johnson, I always assumed he was going to retire. I'm not sure if he promised that earlier on, but he hasn't announced whether or not he's running. What do you think he's going to do?
Yeah, Johnson. Yeah, he's left the door open on whether he'll run again. I think he's running again. I would assume he's running again unless he says otherwise. I definitely think he's going for it.
Pennsylvania, I think, is interesting because I think there's sort of two countervailing trends. Where in the western region of the state, you have the typical population decline in the major area like Pittsburgh, and the rural is shifting right. But at the same time, on the other end of the state, in the Philly area, there are big swings to the left, particularly in a part of the state that is growing. And I feel like in that way, Pennsylvania is a bit different from a place like Michigan and Wisconsin, where the trends, I would say, definitely favor the GOP in the long term, and not necessarily the case in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Pennsylvania. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting things going on in Pennsylvania, particularly so Western Pennsylvania swung towards Biden, while Eastern Ohio continued its swing towards Trump. And that's because we've seen the Pittsburgh suburbs really start to spill over a bit more. We've seen the increase in the suburban sprawl. That's what's starting. That's what's keeping Democrats in the game for now. Is the big suburban sprawl. Though once Biden is off the ballot, Northeast Pennsylvania is going to be again another big concern.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that snapback in northeastern Pennsylvania was arguably favored son effect to some effect. And,
oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, he made some pretty decent gains in Luzerne County.
oh wow, I thought that I didn't know that. I thought he only expanded his margin in Lackawanna. But you're
he made a decent swing back. I mean, he was able to cut down the margin, and that was quite helpful.
I guess let's talk about the thing on everyone's minds. That is Georgia. Where do things stand right now? Because a month ago I thought, yeah, Republicans are probably favored to hold these seats. I don't think that anymore.
Yeah, so the early vote numbers look good for Democrats. The big question mark is who shows up on election day. That is the big question, and we don't really know. Can Republicans get their voters out to vote on election day in enough numbers to offset what looks like very good black turnout, even greater black turnout than we saw in the general election? That's been Warnock's strategy, is to visit Southwest Georgia a lot. You don't normally see candidates campaign there because there aren't a lot of votes. But in a runoff election, it's all about turning out voters, and Democrats need the black vote, and that's an important region. And it seems to be working. Warnock's repeated visits to that region seem to be paying off.
I guess
and that's why Trump is going up to northern Georgia, is to get those voters to do the same for his voters up there, as they're lagging behind in terms of turnout.
I'm still anticipating that Republicans are going to show up on election day, because what I remember in the Georgia 6th special election in 2017 was that when Democrats became energized about that race, what ended up happening was Republicans also became energized. And I guess because it was redder at the time, they ended up holding the seat.
Yeah. Karen handled it. Yeah, that was, and Ossoff would ultimately carry Georgia 6th in the Senate race this year by a not too shabby margin. Well below Biden, but still historically, when you look how red that is, a 5-6 point win in Georgia 6 is amazing for a Democrat.
So I guess just to wrap this up, where do you stand? Perdue or Ossoff, Loeffler or Warnock?
I guess my gut says Republicans win both. I guess that's just my default position, unless proven otherwise. I just don't know if it's enough for Democrats. If Republicans are going to show up in force, mad that they lost the White House. I think that's the big concern.
Okay, before you go, I know that we were having issues earlier on the stream. Things seem to be better now. But actually, sorry, I should clarify. This is being recorded beforehand, not being streamed. Let's try a couple questions again from earlier on, but because I think we'll be able to get a clear answer this time. Do you have a map that stands out to you in terms of something that you've worked on that you're especially proud of?
I would say I was particularly pleased with my map of Georgia's 6th district. I believe it showed 2012, 2016, and 2020. I thought I did a pretty good job conveying the shift there. I was really pleased with that. And another one of my favorite maps that I've done was, boy, I'd say probably one was showing James Langford's shifting coalition from his 2014 special election to his 2016 win. I enjoy doing Oklahoma maps due to its broad geography. I rather like the state.
Yeah, I noticed that that Biden came actually very close to winning Oklahoma County.
Yeah, just missing it by less than a point. Yeah, it's almost there. Yeah, next time it seems pretty likely to go blue, which would be pretty incredible, as a Democrat hasn't won any county in Oklahoma for president since 2000.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a long time ago when Al Gore was on the ballot. That's a real long time in politics.
And I think that this time around, the 2nd district was the reddest district, which is interesting because I think it's the only part of Oklahoma with a plurality of registered Democrats.
Yep, that's still holding on now in the party registration, but that will change soon. Yeah, that will finally flip. Yeah, Trump managed to improve his margin up there. It's rural, very socially conservative, and it is actually home to a rather substantial Native American population. But yeah, in Oklahoma and in Robeson County, North Carolina, the only Native American heavy areas that we saw shift towards Trump.
Yeah, whereas other Native American populations shifted the other way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there was a pretty big swing towards Biden pretty much across the country in most Native heavy areas.
It's just that Oklahoma and Robeson County, North Carolina were the 2 exceptions.
Yeah, those seem to be the only 2. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, before we go,
I guess you could argue. I guess you could argue Alaska too, but its huge third-party vote in 2016 makes it too difficult to really analyze the granular shift. It's too hard to say. The state is simply too friendly to third parties to really tell us much.
Anyway, do you have any tips for those who want to get into election Twitter map making? You may be looking at one of those people, by the way.
I guess just DM me and I'll give them. Yeah, just DM me and I'll send people all the resources I know of to get people started. I'm always happy to help people get started. It's quite fun teaching people how and seeing how they come along.
And where can people find you on Twitter?
People can find me on Twitter at Senor Raposa. I can spell that out for people. It's SENHORRAPOSA.
Well, if you want to start at map making, you know who to turn to. Drew, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
And wishing you a happy new year to you and your family.
You too.